Well, welcome to Plymouth Church's Sunday Forum. My name is Rebecca Miller, and I'm a member of the Sunday Forum Committee. And these are opportunities for conversations about faith and life, and to provide a thoughtful and welcoming learning environment for you at Plymouth. Especially thank you for joining for our first virtual Sunday Forum. Feel free to use the chat option to converse with each other casually. If you have a question for the end of the time, type in the Q&A section. And also if you have any tech support needs, you can let us know it there. Our guest this morning is Julie Neras. She's an ordained Presbyterian clergywoman, spiritual director, retreat leader, and was an associate professor at Hamlin. She's the author of Apprentice to Hope, a source book for difficult times, Seeing the Sacred, A Year in Snapshots, as well as Hope and Poetry, How They Sustain Us. And I also learned this morning she's working on another book. Julie's been part of Plymouth Church since 1986, leading a number of retreats and classes. And as you listen this morning, please consider how this topic relates to your spiritual formation. So please welcome Julie.
Thank you, Rebecca. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this Sunday Forum on a subject I think almost each one of us is hungry for, and that is hope. To say that we are living in tumultuous times and a scary world is an understatement. What a time of cataclysm and change at every level. Some people say the kinds of changes we're living through only happen every 500 years. But here we are. The murder of George Floyd has pulled back the curtain on the pervasive and insidious racism at the core of our society. We live on an imperiled planet. Gun violence, which is near and dear to my heart, not gun violence, passing common sense laws around gun ownership is near to my heart. 93 Americans die every day from gun violence. Tens of thousands among us are hungry. 30 million people are unemployed just in this country. The daily news is enough to make you fall to your knees and weep. There are so many things that should not be so in our world. To have hope, you have to feel like you have a future. And this is at the heart of the anguish among many young people. They're not sure what kind of future they do have. I find it a bit ironic that we just don't sit down and talk very often and explicitly about hope. It's often clustered with its siblings, faith and love. The truth of the matter is, a lot of people live without love, sad to say, and many people live without religious faith, but you don't do very well for very long without hope. And if you've been without hope for more than a little while, we send you off to get help. I consider myself a student of hope. I've been apprenticed to hope for a long time. And I thought I knew a lot about hope. I had done hundreds of funerals. I had done classes, graduate and undergraduate classes on hope. I'd led retreats on hope. I'd worked in a hospital, in a miserable prison in Northeast Philadelphia where hope is severely tested. I'd written about hope at many graduations and commencements. But then about 25 years ago, a chronic illness came swooping into my life. like a ferocious beast. It grabbed me by the neck, thrust me into the fire, and twirled me around and around and around for years, challenging and complicating my relationship with hope. But each of us has complicating factors that challenge hope, right? Hope is a complex and many-layered subject. There's so much to say about it. We only have a little time, so what I thought I would do this morning is focus a bit on the nature of hope and several sources of hope. If this were a retreat, I would want to plant a question in the back of your mind right now. And this is the question. Do you think of yourself as a person who is, by and large, fairly hopeful or not? If you said you're hopeful, what factors contribute to your hopefulness? And if your first response was, well, I'm not so sure I am hopeful, what factors bring you to that place? For our purposes this morning, I'd like to give a very simple working definition of hope. Hope is the sense of a way forward. It's the feeling that things can work out, or that somehow you'll find the resources to deal with whatever life has delivered up. And if there's no way around the problem or to end the problem, that at least there are ways to be in relationship with the problem. Sometimes I think hope is seen as a kind of lightweight subject that's associated with butterflies and flowers. But if that's your understanding of hope, you have never run into a parent who has a child with a grave illness, who is willing to do everything possible on behalf of that child's well-being. Hope can be that tenacious, that fierce, that obstinate. And if all you can see is no exit signs and barred doors, hope is the axe you break down doors with. Maybe Emily Dickinson's famous poem about the thing with feathers, a poem about hope, is partly to, I don't want to say blame, but it's shaped so many of our understandings of hope. I'm sure many of you as grade schoolers or high schoolers memorized that poem. But let's take the bird image a little further. Remember, hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul, that sings the tune without, sings the song without the tune. Well, we in Minnesota know that many birds who are just ounces in weight survive Minnesota winters. Those little tiny beings survive -30 wind chill. Hope is fierce. Hope spawns revolutions. Hope caused all 4 of my Scandinavian grandparents to leave home in search of life on a better shore. We all have seen newsreels of families setting off in rickety boats or banged up cars, putting their lives in peril and their children's lives in peril because the place they live is not safe. They're victims of violence or the violence caused by poverty. Sometimes all people have is hope. I want to share a poem by Marge Piercy entitled Illegal with Only Hope. The mother imagines a few more steps, another push across a minefield. Just one more night hiding in rank bushes. She can carry her child across the border to some kind of safety. Anything better than what she flees, hauling her child through the fields of hell. She has a wound on her leg, untended, unbandaged, bleeding now and then when weeds, branches brush it. She has a deep wound inside. The wan face of her older child as the life drained from it, with blood from the blast that tore his flesh apart. The dusty body of her husband fallen into a ditch, the ditch where she huddled, holding tight, the still living child who is all she can imagine of any future. So she slugs forward toward that invisible border where mothers can keep their children safe, perhaps, in a world on fire. Illegal with Only Hope. Marge Piercy, from a book called What Saves Us, which I would highly commend to you. Hope might be small, but it's potent. A little of the right ingredient goes a long ways. I remember talking with Sonia Cairns, a Plymouth member and leader some years ago, when she had been part of a project in Sierra Leone. We bumped into each other on our daily walks, and she asked what I was doing, and I said, well, I'm working on a book about hope. I said, do the Sierra Leoneans have anything to teach North Americans about hope? And she said, yes, they have only a little hope, but it goes a long ways. Some people seem to have hope so naturally. They wake up in the morning and it's just there, dependably. Others have to struggle through it, through a jungle of depression or psychiatric disorders or other challenges. As we learn more about mental health and genetics and biochemistry, perhaps we're becoming kinder toward those among us who have to work for hope. Sometimes hope is a labor. And if we had more time today, I would share a Sam King poem about that. But maybe you can find it online, and I'm glad to send it to you as Sam has given me permission to. It's about hope being work. Here's another learning. And I attribute my Judaica scholars and colleagues at Hamlin for 27 years where I taught with teaching me this. In Judaism, one of the images or names for God is the grounding pulse. God is the grounding pulse, that one beat at the heart of all creation that we all depend upon. What that also says, though, is that hope, and I would also add faith, isn't something you have or don't have. Sometimes you have a little bit, sometimes you have a lot. About 3 days of the week, I have a lot of hope for the world. On 4 of the rest of the days, I'm not so sure. I have come to see hope more as something we do than something we have. I have learned a great deal. I didn't bring her book from Joanna Macy, a beloved teacher, Buddhist, scholar of systems who's been working for a long time on nonviolence. And she says in her book, Active Hope, you don't have to feel hopeful to work towards something you care about. Intention is what matters. Action is what matters. And she also says, don't run from your despair. Sort of a surprising word of guidance. Wouldn't we mostly want to turn and run away from despair? She says, no, because at the heart of despair is compassion. It's the flaring of somebody else's suffering in you. And what despair gives us, says Joanna Macy, 3 things: the present moment, each other, and nowhere to go but up. So I've been talking to my despair, being in dialogue with it, and I resonate with Joanna Macy's wisdom. A couple of words about the nature of hope. And this is what I would like to spend much more time with you about. In fact, I would love it if we could continue a conversation about hope, because we need it. And I think studying its nature and how it works in people's lives can be extremely helpful and strengthening. So here's the first thing to say about hope. It's much different than optimism. Now, don't get me wrong, wouldn't you rather have an optimist by your side than somebody who's ever ready and eager to throw a little rain on your parade? Yes. Let me not discount optimism. But sometimes optimism denies the tragic sense of life. And for hope to be worth its salt, it has to have its eyes wide open to the sweet, the sour, the salty, as Marge Piercy said, and to be glad for what does not hurt. Hope has to have its eyes wide open, or it's magical thinking, it's luck, it's illusion wrapped up sometimes in religious language. Here's the second learning that's been really key in my own life. Hope can't always be achieved alone. Now, we live in a culture that fiercely prizes individuality and self-sufficiency. There are many jokes about couples going on a trip, and often among the straight couples, it's the woman who's willing to ask for help. I'm sure that breaks down. But hope is not just a private interior resource that we tend and nourish when times are good in hopes that when we really need it, it will be there. No, it's when you feel like you've come to the end of your own resources that you really need hope. Hope is related to help. Sometimes it is that clear and that straightforward. In my own 25-year journey with this nasty chronic illness, a whole lot of things didn't give me huge help, but they gave me a little help, right? And if there's help, there's hope. And closely related to that notion is that hope is often birthed in community. Even if that community is just your family around a dinner table, a church community, maybe a neighborhood where a few neighbors lean over the back fence and talk about how they can be helpful to a troubled teen on their block. Or you buy an hour with your therapist or a spiritual director and talk together about things. Hope is ignited in our interactions. It's often birthed in community. And sometimes, I like to say, we can even borrow hope if we don't have any ourselves. You can't borrow hope from just anyone. Here's a little story about that. When I was growing up, my family spent the summers on a beautiful, pristine mountain lake in northern Idaho. And one of our rituals was to go to swimming lessons at the public beach every June. It was pretty nippy in those waters when you're 6 or 7 or 8, and the lake is so deep that its bottom has not been found in places, something that's not lost on nervous children in swimming lessons. Well, I was the eldest, so I went first, and then I could sit on the warm beach under a towel with my mother and youngest sister, Amy. And then Nancy and Catherine, my 2 middle sisters, were in their lesson. And the day came when it was time to see if the children would be ready to go from beginners to advanced beginners. And the test for that was whether or not they could put their head underwater. So the teacher, a tall woman with a loud whistle, I'm sure she was 8 feet tall. That's certainly what it seemed like to an 8-year-old. She had all the kids grab hands. They walked out into this sandy cove together, and then she had them turn and face her and us on the beach. And she said to the little kids, okay, this is what you're going to do. You're going to plug your nose, close your eyes, sink down to the bottom of the lake, pick up 2 handfuls of sand, and pop up with your hands in the air. That way I'll know if you could keep your head underwater. Well, a whole long line of little kids sunk down there like beads on a string. Oh, except for one little child, my sister Nancy, who was too scared to do that. Lucky for her, Catherine was just on her right side. As Catherine popped up, she realized that Nancy didn't have any sand. So she gave some of her sand to Nancy. Isn't that a great story? Sometimes we can borrow from somebody else's hope until we can fish around in the depths for our own hope. To anchor that in another example, many years ago, maybe 10 or 15, I was in the umpteenth relapse with this illness. I'll never forget. It was sort of a gloomy, sleety day with ice coming down, sleet coming down. And I was really in despair. And my friend Carol came over. I was lying on the sofa, and she moved the coffee table away, and she lay down on the carpet not far from me. And she said, okay, tell me, what is it like to be in the umpteenth relapse? So I complained and kvetched and grieved and yelled and screamed, and then I was at the end of that. And then she said, I know it feels like the storm has stalled, but if you look at the bigger picture, you're moving through it. Here are some of the things you can do that you couldn't have done 3 months ago. Now, had she kind of stayed safely and lobbed, cheery nostrums over the fence at me, I would not have been able to borrow hope from her. Hope requires the truth, right? But she was enough outside of my own situation to be able to see my situation better than I could. Because pain makes you hopeful, hopeless, anguished, tired. You know this. Working with chronic pain is exhausting. But she was trustworthy. And I said, you are right, Carol. It does feel like the storm has stalled. But you're also right that it's moving. And that made all the difference to me. All right. So, hope is different than optimism. Hope is related to help. It's often built and created and strengthened in community. Here is a Jim Germanian line about that. From a sermon he preached in this very pulpit in 2004. The primary quality of hope is not certainty, but vision and imagination. Hope is not certain of a particular future, but it can envision it, enough to continue anyway. Optimism lightens our load by promising a good end, even if the basis for the premise is faulty. Hope, by contrast, doesn't lighten the load, but strengthens us to carry the load, and by claiming that it is all worth it. So that's another of hope's attributes. It's related to the imagination. Now, sometimes the imagination is seen as that human faculty that's about making up things, like fantasy and illusion, magical thinking. No, the imagination is perhaps the highest power of the knowing mind. In the early days when I was working on this book, I would walk the lake with my friend and neighbor, Kate, a Jewish mom par excellence. And I was thinking about imagination. And one day Kate said, you know, I think that's often the primary job of a parent, to very gently, without too much enthusiasm or cheerleading, point out to a child or a teenager that there are options, to scan the horizon for possibilities. Of course, you can't be too enthusiastic or you'll be shut out completely, right? But hope and imagination works together. The imagination refuses to stop imagining. And I remember at my own ordination, today is Seth's ordination, in the Presbyterian Book of Order, a new clergy person or elder promises to serve the people with imagination and love, right? The imagination is a very potent thing. Many years ago, I saw a person for spiritual direction who had been sexually abused in his family. It was a very deep valley to walk through, and healing took a lot of work. But one of the things he told me early on was that in his worst days in his own family, his imagination created an imaginary family. It was in the country. There were horses and fields. There was a tree house he could go to where he would feel safe. And in his mind's eye, he replaced his family with a healthy one. That is a very potent thing, to envision, as Jim says, a different future, to imagine something, and to move toward it. Here's another thought about the nature of hope. If the convulsions in our city and state and country and world around race say anything, it's this: you cannot live on hope forever. Black people have already waited for 400 years. Eventually, hope has to give birth to something, right? Poor people don't want more hope, they want jobs, safe housing, opportunities for their children. Hope has to deliver. Another quality of hope, if it's truly hope, is that it sits next to truth. Hope and truth go together because hope for the future begins with the facts on the ground right now. Our soccer coach used to say, you need to play the ball where it lies on the field, not where you wish it were. And I was most taken by the winner of last year's Nobel Prize for Literature, Olga Tokarczuk from Poland. And she spoke about lies and fake news as a weapon of mass destruction. Hope needs the truth. There are so many threats to hope. Threats that threaten to send hope to the sidelines. And one of them, as we know, is racism. My friend, the poet Margaret Hasse, and her husband David Grothe have two grown sons who are brown-skinned men. One of them used to be the supervisor at the Super America on the corner of University Avenue and 280. And he often would end his shifts late into the night. And when he drove home, if he had his hair in an afro, he would often be pulled over for very nebulous reasons. But if his hair was pulled back in a ponytail, he was much less likely to get pulled over. Here's Margie's poem, Come Home, Sons. Come home, our sons, young drivers. Tell us you're safe, not detained again by police for your dark color, sprocketed hair, and a crime you didn't commit. Maybe your car's the wrong make, or rusty in a neighborhood where cars park in garages at night. Once, when you saw a squad car, you remembered Officer Smiley and his dog that did tricks in read-aloud books at J.J. Hill School. Now, as you reach for your license, with shaking hands, tension raises the chance that something will go wrong. This poem is for you, sons, and for everyone who is afraid. Citizens of police, police of citizens. It's for Philandro Castile, a Black school lunch supervisor in an inner city school who memorized children's names and their food allergies. And it's for the policeman who stopped a car with a damaged taillight. After he used his gun, his voice broke like a frightened child's. Come home, sons, to mothers like me, alert at night, waiting for car lights to beam in front of our house, for the car to belong to our sons, and our sons to still belong to the world. That poem speaks to many a parent in our community and beyond. So what about sources of hope? If you were going to go out and find some hope this afternoon, where would you go? What would you do? Maybe you would go find a group of children, your neighbor kids or your grandchildren who are eager and alive and present. Some of us would go to the natural world. There's something about harmonies and patterns and physical beauty that heals and restores us. I think I might try to find a 12-step group and sit in the back in respect and admiration of people who are finding a way to stay sober, sometimes hour by hour, day by day. I might go to an artist's studio. Or maybe I would join a fisherman or a fisherwoman on the lake. Because that's how hope works. Hope is a fisherman with a very thin line, plumbing the depths. Hope is a musician on her way to the practice studio. Hope is an athlete off to the practice field. Hope is present with us each moment as we look to the next. Why is it then that we talk much more about faith and about love than hope? But while we're on faith, and it would be wonderful to have a whole conversation just about the connection between faith and hope. This is how I imagine it. Faith has to do with meaning making, with finding patterns and coherences that help you feel like life is trustworthy, that beneath all the chaos, something is holding us up. If faith gets us out on the road on behalf of some kind of purpose or meaning, hope is what keeps us there. But they often work together. Back to the 12-step group, though. I think a huge source of hope in our time is the hope that people can truly change, dramatically change. We can change our relationship to fossil fuels. We can somehow root out the racism that seems to be wound into our bodies. We did pass the Civil Rights Act in 1964, but there were acts on the books from the 1860s and 70s that weren't really integrated until 40 years ago. And still, there's lots of work to be done. Some people change dramatically. Sometimes people change minimally, but change in any form can be good. I had a grandmother who was quite a character, and I must say, a bit selfish for her first 85 years of life, but she found her generosity in her 90s, and she had such a great time living after she had found her generosity. What else do we need to change? How have you changed? You probably have many times over. In a week, in a month, in a year, we change. Another source of hope is the imagination, because it is that faculty that allows us to stand in the shoes of another person and imagine what it might be like to be that person. In Ta-Nehisi Coates' book, Between the World and Me, which has taken our country by storm and was meant as a letter to his 15-year-old son, something he said finally took root in me at a level it hadn't before. He said, every Black person in this culture feels physically afraid in public, in any public place, even if that is just to step off the curb in front of his or her own home. What would it be like to live like that in constant fear? The imagination is a very potent tool, and I think the Holy Spirit uses it often. I have two young nephews, Martin and Peter King. They're now accomplished adults, but they were at one point two little tow-headed kids. Martin's name is spelled with an E, not an I. It's a Swedish spelling. But it was not lost on Martin that he had the same name as Martin Luther King Jr. His first paper in second grade was about Martin Luther King. So one day, my father's taking Peter and Martin to soccer practice in Seattle. They're in the back seat. And he overhears a question that Martin asked of Peter. Peter, do you think we're related to Martin Luther King Jr.? Well, there was a long pause. Peter is a very thoughtful guy. He got his master's in philosophy at St. Andrews, and I went over there to congratulate him. So we thought about it for quite a while. Finally, he says from the back seat, well, I don't really think so because we don't have Luther as our middle name. You know, let's hear it for race relations in our country. And in their generation, they don't see race as their parents' and grandparents' generation, which is a huge source of hope. They and Greta Thunberg are leading the way around climate change. There's a lot to be hopeful about with this next generation. But what a planet we are giving them. Well, I'm conscious of the time, and we have about 7 or 8 minutes for some questions, responses, thoughts, which I welcome. So what do we need to do, Rebecca, Cody, to transition to more of a conversation?
If anyone has a question, they can just type it in the Q&A, or they can raise their hand.
This mic, okay. Maybe while we're waiting for those, do any of you in this room have a thought, a question, something this has sparked in you? No? Has somebody typed a question? No? Seth? Oh, you're just, well, so
One source of hope. Am I coming through the mic? Okay. One source of hope. My brother-in-law asked his son, who was at that time young 20s, if there were any adults in the world that he respected. And Nick said, well, I think I respect Ginny Humphrey, my mom. And my brother-in-law said, you don't even know her. How could you possibly have a basis of respect there? And Nick said, well, I was talking to her at a family gathering one time, and I said, how can you always, this is Nick talking now, asking my mom, Ginny Humphrey, how can you always be so cheerful? And mom said, and Nick said, how can you always be so cheerful when there's so much unhappiness in the world? And mom said, well, it's because there's so much happiness and unhappiness in the world that I have to be so cheerful. So I think there's a real kind of a quandary or something about the nature of hope, that it's like, if you don't have it, I don't know how you get it.
I have a thought about that.
Okay, great. I'd love to hear it.
Thank you, John. You know, another very short story that will make the point. A good friend of mine, Kathy Coskren, and her husband have a lake cabin near Mille Lacs, and they've been like grandparents par excellence. Every year they have a Camp Malmo, and then some years it's a science camp, and another year it's an art camp. Well, one night everybody decided to sleep outside in tents. And in the middle of the night, the little 5-year-old granddaughter needed to go to the bathroom inside the cabin, so Kathy accompanied her. And as they were coming outside, the little girl said, "Do you think I could wish upon one of those stars?" And Kathy said, "Yes, that's a terrific idea." So they waited a little bit outside, and Kathy was beginning to wonder if it was difficult to choose, which star to wish on. Finally, she said, "Never mind. It's already perfect. It's already perfect." So one of the practices, I think, that can sustain hope is to name the many things in the world that are right this very minute. So if I were to send you home with a little homework or a practice or a habit, I would have you write down 5 things in your life or your family's life that's right now. Then move to your neighborhood or community. Then move to your city, state, nation. There are many things that are right, which is what we need in order to face into things that are wrong and should not be so. I think we all need sustenance. Paul, do you know the name Paul Hawken? Paul Hawken also is many things, an intellectual. He also helped create the Smith and Hawken garden catalogs. Hawken wrote a book several years ago that I used in a number of my classes called Blessed Unrest. He says that it's a trustworthy fact that somewhere between 1.5 million and 2 million organizations in the world are already working on the environment, for indigenous people, or racial equality. But they're small little NGOs of just 3, 4, 5, 6 people. So it never gets over the bar of the media. So a couple times in my class, we started with the appendix and we read it out loud. Number of organizations working on domestic violence, 6,433. Number of organizations working on the blind albino turtle from South Carolina, 34. There's a lot being done in the world that we just don't see. And I think we need to have a habit of keeping our eyes and ears and hearts open for that. Yes, Rebecca, is there a question?
There's a question. When you want to be there for someone, I believe you mentioned that there's a time that offering hope is not able to be accepted by that person.
Right.
Can you talk about that more? Or maybe, how do you know when timing might be better?
That's a great question. Well, I do think we need to know the setting and the context. And frankly, people don't do very well with chronic stuff. Even faithful friends and family, it gets really old, right? But I think sometimes when people are uncomfortable and don't know what to say or do, they offer a kind of a little chipper, nostrum. "Oh, I'm sure it'll get better." Or, "Gosh, you're looking great," which, how could you respond to that by actually, "No, I'm really not feeling very great"? I think you have to be sensitive to the time in a person's life and not also to trot out false hope. It has to be honest. It has to be truthful. And frankly, I think one of the hardest things for us as human beings is to listen to somebody else's suffering. But it's what ministry is about. It's what love is about. So I think it has to respect, the deep despair or hole you might be in. And I wonder if you find this, when I can kvetch for a while and complain, I generally get to a different place. But I have to start with what's right in front of me, and often things are a drag. So my friend Carol, who said, "The storm has stalled, but it seems in general to be moving onward," was really helpful. And again, if we had much more time, I would love to talk with you about this aspect of hope, that it has to do with the bigger picture. I think sometimes the small little things can strengthen hopes. Sometimes it's the bigger picture that can strengthen hope. So maybe we can find a way for that conversation at Plymouth. I would love it. Because, you know, if you know about a community's hope, you know a lot about them. You know, it's a powerful thing to name our hopes for this faith community. So that would be what I would say. And we are all out of time, I see. So is there a way, Rebecca, Cody, to hang on to people's questions so they don't get lost and we could maybe come back to them at another time? Okay. So did everybody hear that? Who's on the, no. So your questions have been recorded. They won't be lost. And let's talk together about when we might come back to them. If you have questions or comments or responses too. Thanks everyone. Thanks for inviting me to be part of this conversation with you.